Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. Actually, it's a pleasure to welcome you, some of you perhaps for a second time, to the MPR, the multi-purpose room, for a lecture today. I know many of you were here for Dr. Herdbay's lecture earlier at lunchtime on why the UAE is a federation. In any case, it's also my great pleasure to introduce our distinguished lecturer for this evening. Let me just say something about the background, the thoughts I had in inviting Dr. Kassab here. Often one reads about the accolades that people receive, prizes that they receive in the newspapers, about which one is aware on a yearly basis, but then one doesn't get enough exposure to them. They come in and they go before we've had a chance to speak to them. I'm referring to the fact that Dr. Kassab won the very prestigious Sheikh Zayed Award in 2013 for a book in the category of contributions to the development of nations. Of course, it is a great accolade to receive that award. I felt we hadn't had enough chance to speak to her then, so I invited her back. And I do intend through the year to invite people back to Abu Dhabi to speak to them. Recipients of awards. Roger Allen will be coming in the spring, recipient of a Banabal Prize, and actually Marina Warner, who also won a Sheikh Zayed Award along with Elizabeth last year, will be here in January, and we'll be speaking with her and Radwa Ashur on aspects of the Arabian Nights and how they inspire modern authors. So that was the rationale, and I'm very pleased that you accepted our invitation to come. Dr. Kassab studied business administration and philosophy at the AUB, the American University of Beirut, and in the 80s, and continued her graduate studies in philosophy at Freiburg University in Switzerland. She spent 3 years as a postdoc fellow at the University of Bielefeld in Germany thereafter, and returned to Beirut in 1991, where she taught for many years in the philosophy department of AUB, and later at Balamond University up in the north of the country. In 1999, she was awarded a Fulbright fellowship at the New School University of New York. After that, she was visiting scholar at Columbia University for several years and a visiting associate professor at the Yale Center for International and Area Studies between 2006 and 2007. Since 2012, Dr. Kassab has been a Mellon visiting professor at the Kogut Center for the Humanities at Brown University in Providence, and she is currently a fellow at the Kate Hamburger Advanced Center for Law and Culture at the University of Bonn. She is the author, as some of you may know, of The Theory of Social Action in the Schutz-Parsons Debate, and of course most recently of Contemporary Arab Thought, Cultural Critique in Comparative Perspective, Al-Fikr al-Arabi al-Muasir, which was published by the Center for Arab Unity Studies in Beirut in 2012. And it was for this that she won the Sheikh Zayed Award last year. In her book, Dr. Kassab explores approaches to questions of cultural malaise in the Arab world, asks about the relationship between cultural crisis and politics in intellectual debate, and finally endeavors to compare these approaches and debates to related conversations in other post-colonial regions. It's the comparative approach in this book that makes it quite unique. Contemporary Arab Thought, the book, is a work of intellectual history that seeks to understand the process of cultural decolonization within the Arab context. This goal is accomplished first through the survey and analysis of major trends and thinkers, and then through the application of a comparative perspective that brings the Arab world into conversation with Africa, the United States, Europe, and Latin America. Issa Boulata, author of Trends and Issues in Contemporary Arab Thought, has said of Dr. Kassab's book that it is, quote, one of the few in English that can make the Arab world's cultural predicament understandable for open-minded outsiders, end quote. And Ahmed Dalal, who is currently the provost of AUB, has called it the first summative narrative of its kind. Please welcome Dr. Kassab to the podium.
Thank you, Philip. I'm very happy to be here. This is the second time I have the privilege of giving a talk, sharing part of my work here at NYU Abu Dhabi in this very hall. And So it is, as always, a pleasure for me. Indeed, in 2013, my book earned this fantastic award, and I felt very encouraged, especially that it's the Arabic version of it that won that recognition, and that meant to me very much in a very particular way. So what I'm sharing with you this evening is a continuation of that same kind of work, looking at Arab intellectuals in our contemporary times. And what I propose to do today is to compare a little bit 1967 with 2011 insofar as this intellectual history is concerned. Now, why these two dates? When we look at the history of the 20th century for the Arab world, it was quite a dramatic century. When you think how it started, the Arab world being part of the Ottoman Empire, and how it ended, I mean, in between so much happened, is that I think in our families we can go back and see how each generation had to adjust to quite dramatic changes all the time. And, you know, the fall of the Ottoman Empire, then the British and the French mandates, then the wave of independence, then the founding of the State of Israel, the wars, the attempts at unity, until up to the Gulf War, the several Gulf Wars, then 9/11 and what have you. I mean, this is not a boring place. So why pick these two dates? There are many dates which have been, you know, very important, very marking dates. Well, I think there is a consensus, and it will be easier for me to talk about 1967 because time has passed and we can make a sense of it. There is a few decades there where the contours of this event have been more or less defined, whereas 2011 has just happened and we're still wondering where we're going, what's happening to us, and so on. It is a fact for anybody who follows Arab thinkers, Arab intellectuals, even Arabs in general, that 1967, I think there is a consensus that that was a turning point. So I think that's an established fact, that at least in the perception of people, and particularly here, because this is my field, for intellectuals, this has definitely been a turning point. And what I'm going to do is to share with you a little bit in what sense these intellectuals say that it was a turning point. What was so special about it? What was the impact? But the reason why I think we wanted to have 2011 in it, first of all, because it has been another major date, and I think we all agree that 2011 is going to be another marking date in the history of the Arab world. Let me say, in anticipation of my comparison, if you want, that what is common to these two dates is, first of all, the magnitude of change. In both cases, again, I'm talking about the perception of people and the perception of intellectuals, more particularly, that these dates changed the Arab world in a very important way. The second element that is common to them is, I think, the element of shock. In both cases, you have an experience of total surprise. Now, whereas the first one is rather a very negative surprise, it's a very negative shock, 2011 has more of a pleasant surprise to it, an unbelievably pleasant surprise to it, at least in the initial phase, at least in the first days of these events. So, the element of surprise and the magnitude of change. Now, if I want to characterize very rapidly 1967, I would say that for people and for intellectuals in particular, it is perceived to be a founding moment. So it's not only, wow, something very dramatic happening, but something that will mark the coming decades in a very important way. So there is the sense of a founding moment. Now, you all know 1967 is the defeat of Arabs by Israel. It's not the only defeat, it's not also the first defeat. Why wouldn't 1948 be considered to be such? Why 67? I mean, there was almost more disastrous, already such a big disaster in 48. Well, I will be saying a few things about that, but I think that what people also miss usually when they speak of 1967 is not only the defeat by Israel, but also what came afterwards in the various Arab countries in terms of the establishment of dictatorships. So it's a founding moment also in that sense, that you have the establishment of regimes that will last until yesterday. Now, 2011 is also, I think, will be a founding moment. Some intellectuals are saying should be a founding moment, and I'll try to see a little bit in what sense. 1967, as I said, it's not the first defeat. A Nakba, so the real disaster, or the founding disaster, or has already happened in 48. The difference is that by 67, you were supposed to have prepared yourself for now, getting things right and recuperating your rights as an Arab, as the defender of the Palestinian cause. You had a fantastic, charismatic leader out there, Abdel Nasser, and that sense of confidence, that sense of optimism that now things cannot go wrong because you're preparing yourself for it. You know very well your enemy. You know what the geopolitical game is. You are investing in the army. So all things, the element of surprise, the unpreparedness, the inexistence of really states in 48 are no longer there to think that you won't be able to make it. And yet, despite that preparedness and despite that optimism and despite that sense of now having really patriotic leaders, you don't have a corrupt king collaborating with the colonizers, you have really Abdel Nasser. And yet, you end up with this incredible and irremediable defeat. It's a total humiliation in the sense that, of course, you will blame the enemy, you will blame all the Western powers who were there and who caused this and that, but somehow you cannot escape from your own responsibility in the matter. And I think that's one of the founding elements, that you as an Arab cannot anymore blame, at least totally, others for this calamity, for this defeat, and there is no other word for it. There was no escape, I think. And so it's a moment really of soul searching. I think that's the word really that characterizes the decades that follow 67. And also the way it was perceived by intellectuals is that this cannot be understood only as a political and a military defeat, that the armies, the Israeli army was better equipped, or that there was a strategic mistake made. People had a sense that there was more to this defeat than just a political and a military one. Writers, thinkers started to speak of it civilizational defeat, that something more deep, something cultural was not working properly. And so you have a whole array of exercises in self-examination, trying to understand why the defeat happened and to see really what is wrong with us. So it's a moment of self-reflection, but in a background, in a backdrop of defeat and humiliation. So you're sitting there not wondering, my God, how did I achieve this? How wonderful of me. You're reflecting on a self that is humiliated, that is crushed, that is ashamed, that is embarrassed, that is, it's not a moment you like yourself in. To just mention a few titles some of you are, I'm sure, familiar with that indicate this mood, if you want. The book of Constantin Zayed, he had written a book in 48 with the title Ma'na Nakba, the meaning of disaster. And in 67, the man writes another book called Ma'na Nakba Mujaddadan, the meaning of disaster again. And the book is about a reflection on the modes of thinking, the cultural elements, the points of weakness in this general Arab personality or mentality or culture that could lead to such a disaster. Another famous book after 67 is the one by Sadiq al-Azam called Naqd al-Zati Ba'd al-Hazima, Self-Criticism After the Defeat. So this is the mood of 67 and of the decades following it. In terms of explanation, some people said, well, we were defeated because we had not westernized ourselves enough, because of we still think in metaphysical ways instead of being more scientific, instead of applying rational modes of thinking. We still think, some people even said, in religious terms. It's religion, it's an old, unreformed way of viewing the world, in fact, that leads us ultimately to such defeats. Others said that, well, past attempts at Renaissance, the famous 19th century Nahda, seemed not to have been solid enough. In 97, so 30 years after 67, in an interview, Sadiq al-Azam, speaking about that shock experience, says that 67 was like a thunderbolt on many of the intellectuals, which made them realize that all of that reform attempt of the 19th century, early 20th century was superficial, was not serious. And he said that, well, we thought that we could take Muhammad Abdu for granted, we could take Ali Abdel Razak for granted, that all of these debates about how to reform religion, how to update Sharia, we thought, he says, that we could build on that, that was, could be taken for granted. And suddenly, this defeat happens to show us that none of that work of reform, of modernization was really something solid enough that could bring us forward. That the whole project of progress and liberation had failed. Others said that the whole idea of the Nahda was the cause of the defeat, that you think you could sort of get westernized. It is because you allowed yourself to be alienated and westernized instead of going back to more of Islam and more of Turath and more of religion. Some said, well, yes, we should have gone more into Turath, but we should have looked into it in order to sort of adapt it, to find in it elements of progress, like, volumes were written about Turath and Tajdeed, Turath and Matihau. You could find Marxist elements in the Turath. Broadly, I think one can identify two reactions, two trends. One of them was to say we need to radicalize critique. In other words, we have to really sit down and go into critique of ourselves, of our modes of thinking, of our view of the world, of our tradition, in a much more consistent and a more radical, a deeper way. We should reject all forms of determinism. We should be more serious about things we do. We should be more critical in appropriating ideologies, whether it's Marxism, it's socialism. In other words, you have a strong critical trend. And that's what my book was about. The other trend was to say, forget all of this, we turn to religion. Islam huwa al-hal. The real solution, the real answer, the real thing we could build on is our religion, and we should go back to it. So this kind of salvational ideology. Now, all of this, if you can, already tells us that much of the discussion was a culture talk. In other words, obviously 1967 produced a very deep cultural crisis, and the word crisis became, al-azama became a ubiquitous word, and the crisis was primarily cultural, and you almost had a dominating culturalism. Things were interpreted in terms of culture. Why do you have a bad, why were you defeated? Well, you have a wrong culture. Why do you have a wrong culture? Well, you have a wrong culture. How do you fix things? Well, you have to reform culture. Now, this is a particular Arab experience of 67 and what follows. However, also I tried in my book a little bit to put this in a larger comparative post-independence experience. This kind of cultural crisis and cultural malaise is not specific to the Arab world and is not solely due to 67. In fact, when you look a little bit at debates that took place in Africa, Latin America, India, the South Pacific, in the Caribbean, you see that very similar debates happen after independence. So I find it very important to put it in a post-independence context. And this context, when I say post-independence context, I mean the following: that you as a people struggle, you want to get rid of colonialism, and you achieve independence. Now you have your own government. Now you're supposed to have become liberated. You're supposed to be doing better, to be running your economy to your own benefit, to do good to yourself. And unfortunately, in quite a systematic way, if you look around, you see that post-independence for most of these regions was quite a disenchanting experience. So there is then, because as you were struggling against colonialism, the whole anti-colonial and decolonization effort was directed against the other, for obvious reasons. But once you sort of put this other to the side and you're running your own affairs and you fail, then there is another kind of struggle that comes into the picture, and it is more of a self-reflective than work that happens. And as I said, you find it in the Arab world, but you also find it in a strikingly similar way in Latin America, in Africa, and in India, and these third world countries. But in connection and in the Arab world, so usually 67 was associated with this defeat of Israel, but more and more, as time went by, Arab intellectuals were also referring to the regimes that got established after 67. All these revolutionary regimes, the Muammar Qaddafis, Saddam Hussein, Hafiz al-Assad, all these people who came to power and produced the regimes that you know. So for especially the critical thinkers who were not totally absorbed in this culturalistic approach to the malaise, we're saying that, listen, we got defeated and there is something wrong with us because people are disenfranchised. Because people are not given the right, are prevented from holding their governments accountable, of participating in political life. And as I do in my book, I started with this wonderful, wonderful play by Syrian playwright Saadallah Wannous, who immediately after the defeat writes this fantastic play in which the question is, why did we get defeated? And his answer is crystal clear. It's because people were disenfranchised, disabled, so pushed in the back, told to mind their own businesses, not to mix and leave politics and government to the rulers, and the repression that continued. So one of my discoveries actually in following this Arab debate, post-67 Arab debate, was to see that there was a lot of culturalist talk. A lot of people were busy with authenticity and identity and culture and cultural critique and cultural reform and westernization, no westernization, and turath, this ever floating term. But some people were very clear about the problem, that it was political, that something was wrong, obviously, in the Arab world, in the different Arab countries, and that was the lack of democracy. Now, these people, unfortunately, are not very well known. This is why I wanted to write a book about them. I was so happy to discover them. They were not obscure figures. The thinkers whose work I looked at are not, marginal, obscure figures whom nobody knows. They were, and still are, major figures of the Arab intellectual scene, but for many, they were not worth being translated, they were not exotic enough, and there was so, when you're just a critical thinker, you're not very attractive, you're not, you cannot be put in a nice box and get exoticized, you're not sensational, and of course, you're not allowed to disseminate your work much. And I must say that there was so much attention devoted to Islamism and the rise of Islamism that, some non-Islamist thinker was not interesting, apparently, to be read or to be discussed. Now, these intellectuals that I call the critical intellectuals existed. In general, if one wants to speak of what these dictatorships did to the intellectual scene, as you can very well imagine, some were co-opted, became spokesmen in general of the regimes. Some were bought up by money, petro money, and some of them were repressed, intimidated, silenced, marginalized, exiled, executed, assassinated, reduced to triviality, forbidden to teach, forbidden to write. So these people didn't have the space nor the capacity to disseminate their idea, especially not when they were saying that the problem is the lack of democracy or that the problem was primarily political. Of course, regimes were very happy to hark on the business of authenticity, al-asala, wal-hadasa, wal-hadasa, wal-asala, this endless sort of mantra, while the problem was somewhere else. And of course, the regimes had used the Islamists to crush the left, and it was duly done. If they were not executed in prisons in Iraq, in Sudan, in Syria, they were taken care of by the Islamists. And then the Islamists were made into this evil that only regimes could protect us from. Now, when you read these critical thinkers who were saying that the problem is political, their lucidity and clarity is absolutely striking. That in the midst of all this haze of culturalism and authenticity business and identity crisis, that people were simply saying, look, our problem is that we are governed by thugs. We have no control over our government. But the other striking thing was this lucidity that was totally paralyzed. That you could read these people and say, my God, they are understanding what is happening, except that the margin of translating this lucidity in any way of institutional change was ruled out. And by the eve of 2011, if you want, that's almost the time when I finished my book. I worked on it for about 10 years, was the sense of helplessness. I think, and I always say this in my talks, the word that I heard and read most often in whether it was conferences or panel discussions or interviews or books or articles, the word that kept on recurring was that of ajz. Impotence, helplessness, incapacitation. That you are seeing things rotting in economy, in education, in healthcare, in the media, in culture, in politics, obviously, and there is absolutely nothing you can do about anything. So this period, say between 67 and 2011, is one of really very somber despair, but also a time when intellectuals, many of them who were fervent leftists, or not necessarily being on the left or on the right, but just militants, people who really believed or who hoped that things would get better. With the Camp David Accord, with all the failure of Arab unity, you have failure and defeat wherever you turn. But there is also, you find, because I think of the massiveness of the despair, also a determination to keep hope alive. That it becomes, optimism or hopefulness was no longer some natural inclination or something that you found in things inspiring you, but it becomes really a decision, a very willful decision to keep. And I think that by 2011, Arab thinkers had become very humbled. I'm thinking about those who think. And already this business of pontificating, of being the avant-garde, the leading the people, they were this idea that the thinker is the one who has seen it and who has the right vision. I think thinkers had already given up on that. In 2006, in a series of interviews in Al Hayat newspaper, this was the question, how you intellectuals see yourself in this mess, basically, and so many of them really felt that it was time to engage people and to sort of work with them and be in tune with them, if anything was, and that work was going to be very slow, very piecemeal, that change was not going to come. In fact, there was a deep conviction that nothing was going to move ever. Okay, and then 2011 happened. And I think that the basic contrast is the comeback of the people. If 1967 was really the disappearance of the people by the rulers, 2011, as you all watched on your television screens, is really the comeback of people. And so these intellectuals, those who lived through this phase, 67, 2011, are, you know, just their jaws dropping and not believing that something could move, that people could come into existence. And I have read really very moving editorials by poets and writers just being in awe of the courage, because it took courage to face these criminals. And what I've been doing since then is really following the reaction of Arab intellectuals to these uprisings. Now, as I was saying, it's more difficult to speak about 2011 because it's yesterday. But already one can venture and make a few remarks. The comeback of the people. It is people really storming the political sphere, storming the streets, and by empowering themselves, empower the intellectuals. Because, and this is, I think, the interesting thing here, is you have two reactions by the intellectuals. On the one hand, the joy of rediscovering the people, because you remember, so when I was saying, you know, our problem is the lack of democracy, the problem is the disenfranchisement of people, the problem is political. Well, political means people. Political is not writing a book. Writing a book can play a role, but a role. Ultimately, politics is the work of people and not the work of intellectuals as individuals. And Elias Khouri, for instance, will say over and over again, the dictators did not fall in books, by books, they fell in the streets by the people. So on the one hand, I think there is this clear definition of the sphere and the work of intellectuals, that it is limited. It is a limited kind of activity. It is a specific kind of activity, because in the silence and in the paralysis of the people, you find yourself as an intellectual alone, isolated. Taher Labib, the Tunisian sociologist, was saying, we remembered for whom we were writing and for whom we were, in fact, struggling. That, as I said, that the demand for democracy, the demand for political participation is the demand for us as people, not as me as the intellectual or the sociologist. So it's a intellectual work, having been inflated, if you want, sort of refines its normal size to be one part of the efforts of a people to reflect on itself, to articulate things, to formulate things, but also only part of a larger enterprise. And the other observation, if you want, by intellectuals is to say that, okay, so then what is our work? What is this specific kind of activity we should be busy doing? And that is the work of articulation, of formulation, of giving sense, but not giving sense in the sense of pontificating like out of my isolated mind. It's really a work of reflection, of articulation from what is going on, and intellectuals are part of the people. Now, there is one thing that is very different also from 67, it's that it's a very pleasant surprise, was at least up to a certain point, in the sense that it's an unbelievable positive thing, that you could get rid of dictators, that people could have a say, people could have the maturity and the clarity of demanding. Now, there were many questions because, as you know, you all heard that these uprisings were leaderless, that intellectuals were nowhere to be seen, so the usual question was, where are the intellectuals? My thesis on this is that if you read those intellectuals over those 4 decades between 67 and 2011, I see them to be very much in tune with their people. And I see that in 4 points. First of all, these intellectuals were saying our problem is more of a self, directed towards the self. We're not criticizing the enemy, the outside, the West, the other. They were busy doing a kind of self-reflective work. And I think the people who went on the streets in Cairo, in Damascus, in Tunis, as you all noticed, they were not accusing Israel, the West, not because the harm coming from them has stopped, but because people realized that, first of all, the biggest harm that prevented you from defending yourself from the other harms was the local government. So it's addressing really an inner kind of problem. Secondly, I think the primacy of politics, that people went on the streets not to say, well, we need to have a more authentic culture. We didn't hear that. People went to say, we don't want dictatorship, we want accountability, we want participation. We don't want corruption. So that we can have physical safety, so that we can find jobs, so that we can run the economy properly. Then it was very non-ideological. And I think this is something many people observed, that it was not for Marxism or for Pan-Arabism or for Islam. People went there for what they were asking for: dignity. And that's not much of an ideology in the standard way that we understand it. And fourth, the absence of leadership. Well, as I said, intellectuals had already given up on this business of leadership. One last remark, and that brings me to the close. 2011 has just started, and after the time of euphoria, we have been witnessing a comeback of brutalization in the most atrocious way. And if people, the whole uprising was really to demand a more humane way of leading public life and personal life, well, there is a very strong dehumanization that is taking place, whether, of course, the worst scene for that is in Syria, but in Egypt, the use of violence. People went initially on the streets to protest against police brutality. And what is happening now, whether in Egypt or Syria or even Tunisia, is very troubling in that sense. So one cannot but wonder in great anxiety whether we're not going to end up with another defeat, another negative founding moment. But I guess if 67, 2011 didn't manage to crush totally this yearning for a dignified human life, maybe 2011 and the following years won't be able to do it. I think that's the only hope one can sort of sustain, and it, with some voluntarism, but also not be deeply disturbed by the extreme violence that is coming back to the Arab cities and towns. So are we heading to another defeat? Inshallah la. Thank you.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. But I still have a problem is sort of in using the term Arab so generally. I think if you look at the experience, at least the recent experiences, different Arabic-speaking countries have completely different experience from the others. And even when we call it, even when you label the defeat or the success, that was again, was it really all Arabs part of it? Or was it not? I hope that if you can extrapolate
Very
on that.
important point. You're absolutely right. I think this is Levant centrism. We think that we are the Arab world, and we're so absorbed with this defeat and humiliation and never-ending turmoil. Indeed, and for me, for instance, coming to the UAE has always been, oh, my God, you can be an Arab and not be defeated, not be living in a lousy state, not be hopeful, be proud, and that sense of possibility, that has always struck me here. That, you know, one decides something, the plans on a project, and brings it to fruition. This is so you're absolutely right. And one of the things I think in 2011, the two sides, I think at the beginning of the uprisings, there was this whole business of pan-Arabism, the whole notion of Arabhood, and of course, after 67, it was emptied of its content, and so often it was imposed, and so people had become skeptical about it, cynical about it. It has lost all meaning. And suddenly, when these uprisings happened one after the other, there was such empathy, if you want, at least among countries that had been through the same pains of dictatorships, of repression, that you could empathize. And there was a sense of commonness there. And then, unfortunately, that too has been hit hard now with the Egyptian-Syrian tensions and all of the different other tensions. I think we have come into a different phase now. But for a moment, you know, there was the sense of being together or sharing so much pain and so much hope for a moment. No? But your point is well taken.
Thank you so much for your lecture, which was truly, truly wonderful. I enjoyed it so much, you have no idea. You were talking about change and the capacity for change and the failure for effective change to take place. And the way that this has been analysed by the Arab intellectual community in terms of political issues. Yet some of the themes that you talked about were of humiliation, of change, of the need for self-reflection. And I guess my question is, where has the role of psychology been in the Arab intellectual tradition? Where is the role of psychology in terms of analysing the barriers to effective change that have taken place? And why do you feel that there is such a lack of analysis on this level?
I had in mind institutional change, like, for instance, schools. That the level of teaching has deteriorated so much because you're running schools like you run the state institutions. It's corrupt. You put people who are not competent. There's no accountability, and the whole thing, you know. And pauperization because of the mismanagement of wealth. You want to change the media structure, the unions. So that is clear. I think the repression that explains why you aren't able to. Now, one of the things I think that the Arab world, that's some Arab societies, what we lack is really social scientific work. There is work done. And I'm sure that there are psychological and sociological and whatever you work being done. But in general, I think we lack empirical knowledge of our own societies. And that might have also something to do with repression, because it's not something you really want to encourage people to go out and find out how people are faring. And, but definitely, yes, that would be an interesting area. And in my field, for instance, I can read books. I can read a little bit. That's the limit of my competence, if you want. But when people ask me, well, what about the reception of these books? Who's reading them? What impact? I don't know how to, because we don't have sociology of knowledge, reception theories. There are, but I think not enough, and I would like to see much more of that being conducted. But yeah, all of those levels, I think, well, you find maybe the richest reservoir of analysis and of reflection happens in fiction. And you have a wonderful contemporary Arab literature that reflects much of those yearnings and frustrations and humiliations. I mean, some of the novels which came out of Algeria, Yasmina Khadra's, despite all the controversy around him, his novels on the yearning of those young men who eventually become Islamists in a quest for dignity and freedom, exactly in those terms. This is the 80s. So I think literature does embody much of those more inner levels of struggle and frustration and yearning.
Thank you for this wonderful evening. I think, I don't know if it's a comment or a question, but we're talking about this very difficult transition that we are seeing in Egypt, in Libya, in Tunisia, and you're talking about another defeat. And what I'm saying is that this difficult transition that we are seeing is the result of 30 or 40 years of dictatorship. All the problems that were kept suppressed, like poverty, for example, illiteracy, militant Islam. We have never talked about Islamic extremism until 2011. And until, actually in Egypt, I'm talking about Egypt because I am from there, June 30th, when the people, took to the streets and rejected the Brotherhood government. I mean, this was the very first time when we see Arabs talking and criticizing Islamic extremism. And I think this is a very positive step. And all the problems that we are seeing today, all the violence that we are seeing, is the result of 30 and 40 years of repression and dictatorship. Now we have to deal with all the problems that were kept, under the rug, like extremism, Islamic extremism, the poverty, the terrible gap between the rich and the poor in those Arab countries. And of course, I'm talking about Egypt because I am from there. Now, I have another comment on what the gentleman said over there. What are those people asking for? They're not asking for another Dubai or another Qatar, because I was there and I witnessed the revolution and the Arab uprising, and I talked to those revolutionary people. And they wanted very simple things. They wanted dignity. They wanted bread, be able to find a job and, sustain your family. They wanted very simple things. No ideology, no Marxism, no, it was very spontaneous. It was a beautiful thing. And I think when I refuse to think about defeat because, well, the whole subject is very emotional for me, but that difficult transition that we are seeing today is because of 30 and 40 years of dictatorship and, you know, oppression and suppression and all that.
But like, I would say a few comments. Unfortunately, it might be true, and it certainly is. I think that all of what is the mess that we are witnessing here is that because the cover of the exploding pan is being lifted. But unfortunately, that might lead to a defeat. It's not because, yes, the causes were there because of the repression that they're not going to lead to another disaster. And your comment reminded me of something I wanted to mention about intellectual work and political work. Of course, I think this is a common observation that, well, once the dictators were gone, it turned out that the most organized movement was the Islamist one. And the others, call them liberal, left, right, whatever, people who were not Islamist and who were against dictatorship lacked organization. And intellectuals then started saying, look, we need to be politically organized. We need to engage in politics in the sense that it's not enough, again, Ilyas Khouri, it's not enough to have ideas, you know? I can stand here and say, well, I want dignity, and I can go participate in demonstrations. Fine, and then I need, or somebody, political parties, people have to get politically organized to get political things done. Yani there is the realization that ideas on their own or yearnings on their own will not be enough, that politics, if we agree that the problem is political and we want political participation, well, you have to participate. And in order to participate effectively, you have to get organized. And that's a know-how and an experience that we don't have. And you see it, it's a bit, yesterday I saw a wonderful film on the Iranian revolution, women who have been arrested and jailed and talking about their experiences. And the line that struck me was, again, the whole people marched against the Shah, but the ones who took power were the Islamists because they were organized as an organization. In other words, there is, I think, a realization now, whether in Tunisia, in Egypt, that also in Syria, that if you want to have something politically done, you have to do politics. And doing politics is a skill, an activity of its own, that is different from writing slogans and writing books and engaging in ideas. And here is another challenge. Come and organize yourself politically overnight. And the other comment, sadly, yes, maybe for some of us it's good to realize that so many people are against another form of authoritarianism in the name of Islam, Islamism. But then what people are ready to tolerate, to suppress that, is also very worrying. That you can not mind that an army kills people left and right in the name of suppressing some authoritarian or abusive organization. That's very, very worrying. So.
Since your book is about Arab intellectuals, when we read about Western intellectuals, we see them speaking truth to power. Do you see our Arab intellectuals do that? Do they dare to speak truth to power?
Very much so. And they are dazzling in their courage and in their lucidity. Very unfortunately, we don't need that. We don't read them. Our schools don't teach them. We don't regard them we don't know that they exist. And that's very sad, I think. And that's why I wrote this book.